What's up, peers, and welcome to the World Crypto Network. Here for a late version, but still very heartfelt. I am going to present today my talk of the Bolt-A-Thon Lightning Network Cyberspace Conference, which used to be on the 5th till 7th of April, just last weekend. Unfortunately, because I was at the Understanding Bitcoin conference, and that was a damn long day, and I kind of misscheduled everything, and I missed my talk, which was at 1 a.m., just after midnight for myself. And thus, we are going to talk about today what actually was scheduled for me right here. We have a bunch of awesome peers that did their presentations, and the awesome conference that here the Bolt-A-Thon is, you can easily buy your tickets to these peers and then watch their shows, right? And there will be recordings uploaded really soon. And then you can also make sure that you have all the questions and answers here from these people. So usually this was a let's say a Zoom conference. So the those that have bought a ticket had the opportunity to make sure that they get their questions in by jumping into the Zoom. And we're going to do something quite similar. So right here, I put this in the chat. This is the Google Hangouts link. So please feel free to jump in anytime and ask your questions for whatever reason. So today I am going to finally talk about the sound economics of the Lightning Network. And I will presume here that you have watched these talks, or at least that you know a little bit about the basics of Lightning Network. So I will not talk too much about the technical side, the economic side, or sorry, not the technical side, not too much, a little bit, but I will focus on, let's say, the ethical side and especially the economical side. Um, so yes, if you don't know who I am here, I am Max Hillebrand, a co-creator of the World Crypto Network, and we do a bunch of videos here and open source entrepreneur, supporting all the awesome projects that deserve our support, and including, of course, the Nodal Wasabi Wallet Cold Card, but of course doing educational videos here live on the World Crypto Network. Okay, but without any further ado, let's jump into what we will cover today. Um, I hope you can see that actually. Can I make that a bit? No, not really. I hope you can read everything. Please let me know if you can read this here in the chat. Um, yeah. Okay, so what will I cover? First and foremost, a bit about praxeology and what that actually is. What is actually economic thought and economic analysis, right? And then something that is very dear to my heart: the difference between scarcity and non-scarcity, and why this is such a universal and fundamental difference, and then how Bitcoin fits into all this, and how Bitcoin is both non-scarce on a protocol level, and then also how it is scarce in the monetary aspect. And then what functions actually a money fulfills, and how a blockchain, especially the Bitcoin blockchain, verified by the full nodes, make sure that this monetary consensus is enforced. And then we're going to get into the nitty gritty, how we can have payment channels, and how these scripts are set up, and how these are off chain defenses of the very important private property right? Uh, and then the different ways that you can close a payment channel, and how that can be analyzed on an economic point of view, as well then as transferring the property rights with routing and all that good stuff. So yes, let's jump right into it. What is actually economic analysis? What is economic theory? And I call that, or not I, but this is praxeology, which is a term defined by Ludwig von Mises in the early 1900s. And please go to Mises.org and read all of his writings. Very important man. And basically, and this is, I think, a nice definition, so I might just read it. Praxeology is the axiomatic science of purposeful human action to remove uneasiness by allocating scarce resources in times of uncertainty. really long convoluted sentence. So basically, axiomatic science means we start with underlying groundbreaking truths that we know without a shattering of a doubt to be the truth. And then, because we know that the fundament is the truth, we can build on top of that in a logical, pretty common sense reasoning, and then we can end up at elaborate schemes, which is really awesome, because once we then can verify that all the steps that we take are logical, we conclude that our analysis is truthful. Purposeful human action, very important. This is something of ingenuity, right? Humans act, and they do so because they would want to remove some uneasiness, something that makes the world just a little bit more delightful. Very important here again, and that is also the very crucial part which we will cover today: the allocation of scarce resources. So resources that can only be done with one task. But the question is, what do we do with the things that we have, including our time and attention? And also, it would be boring if we knew everything, right? But we live in times of uncertainty. We need to make sure that, or we don't know exactly how the future will play out. And so all this together is praxeology. That this is a objective and a universal part of economics, or economics is a subdiscipline of praxeology. And the objective and universal part is absolutely true because we start with axiomatic truths, which we know to be truthful, right? And thus, Austrian economics specifically, but economics in general and praxeology, do apply at any time, at any place, regardless for whatever is going on. And it is both a theory of the isolated individual. So Alice and Bob, right? Or just Alice sitting on a lonely island, right? But human action still applies to someone who is lonely on that island, right? But of course, it gets really interesting once we then have the voluntary interpersonal exchange. That is then the marketplace, the agora. Um, Yes. Okay. So the really fundamental, groundbreaking axiom is scarcity. And scarcity is often misunderstood to mean something like rarity or abundance, right? That something where we don't have a lot of things, like, I don't know, diamonds, for example, right? Diamonds are scarce. No, well, scarcity is not the quantity of a good, but rather scarcity is a binary attribute, in the sense that that either something is scarce or something is not scarce. There is no such a thing as a half scarcity, right? And the scarcity or a good is scarce if there is. Or if it can only be used by one individual for one task at any time. And this means that this individual has to have the ultimate decision where to allocate these resources, right? Because he is controlling it. And because only one person can control such a scarce good, there is also a potential of conflict over who can control this scarce good. Right? So, as an example, if we have Alice and Bob, and Alice has a gold coin in her hand and she looks at it, right, and holds it, then she is holding it, right? And at the same time, the exact same gold coin cannot be held by Bob, right? And so this is a potential conflict of control. Who is going to hold the gold coin? Is it going to be Alice or is it going to be Bob? It cannot be both of them at the time. And this is then a question of resource allocation, right? We have scarce resources, only one person can have them and can use them. So who will it be? And there are many different ways that we could define such a rule, but one rule set that is very intuitive and I would say absolutely true and irrefutable is individual property right. In first and foremost, yourself, right? Your body and your time and your attention is yours, and you have the property right to fully manage and allocate these resources to whatever way you want to do, right? And this gives you full control, not just over the good itself, but also of all the services that can be derived from that good. So, for example, if Alice picks a apple from a apple tree, And then, of course, she has homesteaded this apple. She has taken what is abundant in nature and all around us, and where no one else has used this apple. And she has then intermingled her human ingenuity with that apple to pick it, right? And now she can further make that apple into a apple pie, for example. And then that apple pie would be a service that she has derived from the original natural good, the natural resource of the raw apple. And because this is still then hers, right? This is still her property. But then the thing is, what can you do with that property? Well, she can do whatever, right? She could consume that apple and she could eat it or that apple cake, right? That is full up to her power. But the beautiful thing is that she can also exchange it voluntarily so with Bob, in a sense that she gives away the property right in that apple pie. Right, she sacrifices to no longer have the full ultimate control of that apple pie, but then she gets something in return, right? Bob is sacrificing something else. For example, a couple logs of wood, right, that he has homesteaded and produced. And because Bob is voluntarily accepting to do this trade of wood versus apples, um, and because both party voluntarily agree, we know and we can praxeologically prove that it was mutually beneficial for both parties. Because otherwise, neither Alice nor Bob would have voluntarily chosen to do this trade. And we can prove that with subjective marginal preferences, right? Alice thought before she did the trade that she would be better off with the wood and not the apple. So, marginally, just a little tiny bit, um, and subjectively, so only she knows that. Bob cannot look into Alice's brain and judge for himself whether Alice would prefer the apples or the wood. He can only experience what Alice's choice is as soon as she has acted this out. And the beauty is that when we have a voluntary trade, it is mutually beneficial for all. And that's why the free market is so beautiful. Okay, so to sum up, there are scarce good that can only be allocated to one specific task at one specific time. And thus, we need resource allocation. And property rights is a way of doing these resource allocations. And you can either homestead a good or then you can exchange it for it. But there's no other way of acquiring property rights. Uh, and then on the other hand, we have non scarcity, right? And so non scarcity, again, is the complete binary opposite of scarcity. And it means that a good can be shared with others without taking something away from the original creator. Um, and because, or so imagine this. So if now I or Alice sings Bob a little song, right? Then Alice gives away the lyrics, right? The words that she's speaking, as well as the melody and all that, and she gives that to Bob. And so Bob acquires something, right? He has something that he did not have before. It is still a economic good, right? But it is non-scarce in a sense that as soon as Alice has spoken these words, and sang her song, she still retains the quote unquote original, right? She did not give away these words. She did not lose access to them. She did not forget them, but she only shared it with Bob. And the beautiful thing of such non scarce goods is that there is no potential of conflict, because anyone who wants to have these non scarce information can simply get them because no one is giving something up. No one is sacrificing anything in order to share this knowledge, this information. And again, anyone who desires it, it really does not matter. And no one has to expense anything. There, and because there is no potential of conflict, we do not need to do resource allocation, right? Because we can just spam the internet with, for example, the video that I produce right now. And I do not need to claim that I am the only one to control and use this information, right? On the contrary, I can share it with others. And therefore, we do not need individual property rights for resource allocation, right? That is beautiful because that means that we can share knowledge with others without them having to give something up in return. And thus, information is one of the many or non-scarce goods, and that can be anything, right? That can be speech, that can be, for example, a PDF document online, that can be an idea, and all these non-scarce goods that can be shared without taking away from someone. They are in the public domain of mindspace, of cyberspace. And this means that we don't have property rights, but they are in the Creative Commons. So, and the beautiful thing is that when you are sharing this information, right, not only do you not give anything away, but actually you help others, you raise your peers. And this means several things. First and foremost, that they know about your idea, about this information. And thus, your information has a larger network effect. And your idea thus becomes more valuable, right? If Satoshi Nakamoto has this beautiful idea of Bitcoin, right? But he does not share it with anyone, but he only knows about it. Well, what is that then, right? It's worthless. It really is. And this means, right, that uh, when we share this knowledge with others, it becomes more valuable in and of itself because it has the potential to influence others in a positive way. And because then your peers are being raised, right? You decrease the knowledge differential. This means that your peers are going to be more productive, right? More awesome, so to say. And therefore they then can be part in working together with you on scarce resource production, right? So giving something away without sacrificing, that is the beauty of non-scarcity. And now let's conceptualize that and bring it back to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin with the capital B, right, the protocol is non-scarce open source code and speech, right? You can go to Bitcoin or to github.com/bitcoin/bitcoin and you see every single bit in the source code, and you don't have to ask for permission to get it. And when you take it from GitHub, you don't take it away from someone else, right? But you just copy the information, you clone it, you fork it. And so the open source code in and of itself, the specific set of rules, which is Nakamoto consensus, is in and of itself completely non-scarce. And thus, no one controls Bitcoin, the protocol, because no one has the property rights, because we do not need to have these property rights. But the beautiful thing is that Nakamoto consensus, as it is such a beautiful pattern of speech that out of this network of peers sharing knowledge and information, we somehow emerge non-scarce goods. So we manage a way that just out of us blabbering and talking, that we create a good, a economic good that is scarce. And this scarce good is Bitcoin, the currency with a lowercase b, right? Because either Alice has the Bitcoin or Bob has the Bitcoin, right? And both cannot have the same Bitcoin at the same time and do different things with it. And so, on a technical level, on a network level, the scarce good is actually the value field of the output denominated in Bitcoin, right? So in the transaction, you there are a bunch of things encoded, but one little tiny thing is value equals, and then in quotations, the Bitcoin, however much it is, down defined to the eighth decimal point, which is one Satoshi. And so this is the scarce Bitcoin. This value, this number field, is the scarce Bitcoin. And we know that it is scarce because only one non-scarce script can transfer the property or the property rights of these Bitcoin. Um, so the script that locks up Bitcoin, which again the script is just words, object multisig, right? That's just words. There are no property rights in here. They are non-scarce. But because of Nakamoto consensus, we can use these non-scarce scripts in a way that one UTXO, one n value field, is at any time in the Bitcoin blockchain only enforceable and claimable, so to say, with that one single script. And thus, the Bitcoin, the currency, the unit, is scarce. But the way that we control it is non scarce. And that is quite beautiful, right? So there are different types of scripts that we can define our property rights with. So as I said, right, that could be, for example, a pay to public key hash, which is just a regular single signature. There is this one private key, again, a private key, a non-scarce piece of information. And this private key, if proven that one knows this non scarce information, can then transfer the UTXO to some other script, right? But only if and only if you have knowledge of this private key can you then claim the property rights of the n value field of the Bitcoin. And then you can spend that coin again, right? Another type of script will be very generically the pay to script hash, which then is not just one single private key, but it can actually be a bunch of different things. And Bitcoin script is very exhaustive because it is non scarce speech. And although it is not Turing complete, we can still weave this pattern of speech very profoundly. And we can create a lot of really cool definitions of who controls this UTXO. For example, as I mentioned earlier, multisig, right? Op check multisig, then a two, three public keys, then a three. That is a script that commits to the property right definition that this one UTXO can only be spent by two out of the three proofs of knowledge of a private key, a signature, right? And that is just a different way of defending your property rights and defining it, right? And of course also time blocks or some other things. And we can use these different bricks of building a pattern of speech in order then to define and defend property rights. So then now that we have established that Bitcoin, the currency, with a lowercase b is a scarce good, then we can go further. Because yes, we say Bitcoin is money, right? It is sound money. But a sound money, first and foremost, needs to be a good, which is scarce. We need to be able to use and exchange this good in a sense that it is a store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. And it can only be all of these things if it is first and foremost scarce. And that was the main pain point that we could not figure out for the last 30, 40, 50 years after the internet and before Bitcoin. We could not find a way of making non scarce information behave as if it would be scarce. But Bitcoin made it work. And that's why so many people still doubt Bitcoin, because it is literally shattering here the universal divide between scarcity and non-scarcity. And that's, I think, is one of the main pain points why there are still so many skeptics, and rightfully so. So then, the first aspect of a currency is always to hold it, right? We hold Bitcoin. And what does that mean? We sacrifice today's consumption and gratification of needs and desires, right? You could buy a Lambo today with your Bitcoin, but why don't you do it, right? You don't because you sacrifice the pleasure of having a Lambo now because you believe that you might need that in the future, right? And the future is always uncertain. But when we postpone our consumption and we postpone our production, then this means that in the future we can be more prosperous. And we don't waste our wealth today. Because if you would buy a Lambo every single second of every single day, pretty soon you would have no value left, no wealth left. And so Bitcoin or money in general is a way of storing your value in a sense that you do not consume it, right? You do not produce with Bitcoin, but rather you hold it, not because you can eat it or because you can build a beautiful house out of it, but because you can but rather because you desire to acquire one of these goods, either a consumption or a production good, later. Okay. So we hold Bitcoin today because we are not quite sure what we want to buy tomorrow, right? But we want to buy something. That right, we need to consume. We need to eat eventually. We need to have a shelter. We need to get from place A to place B. Right? Sooner or later, we have to produce. But Bitcoin gives you the opportunity to not exactly know when you need to consume and what you want to consume. So, money, as being defined as the most saleable medium of exchange, means that it is you can hold this currency today, regardless what happens tomorrow. You can still then be able to buy something with it, and that thing which you then later desire. But today, you don't know yet what you want, and you don't know when you want it. And so you hold money so that you can later exchange it for something that you actually, quote unquote, desire. Um, and that is the point of a money as a medium of exchange, right? that that then in that point of time where you actually do want to have the consumption good, where you actually do want to produce something, that is the point in time, the one single moment where you use currency as a medium of exchange. But the vast majority of currency is the store of value aspect, the ability to hold wealth in a way that it is liquid and that you can do something else with it in the uncertain future. Because if we would live in a completely certain future, we would not need to have a money. Okay. So then once, or entrepreneurs, right? And entrepreneurs, I define them as just humans removing uneasiness in times of uncertainty. That is my definition of entrepreneurs. I don't mean the Silicon Valley type, right? Um, you are an entrepreneur just by providing a service to others and by helping others. And so entrepreneurs predict the future customer demand. So you, as an entrepreneur, anticipate the problems of others in the future, and then you judge whether or not you might help them out, and whether or not you can remove some uneasiness for them. And if yes, if you judge that yes, actually, I think I can help these other people, then you will invest today in order to build yourself and the goods around you, and increase the production stages of these goods so that in the future you can help these people out. And because you produce a scarce good, you don't have to give it away, but you actually can exchange it for goods and services, right? Because you do have property rights, because you did sacrifice something and you did invest today, right? And so that later you can help others. And this will, of course, mean that you will get revenue, right? So that that you will eventually then have a income, that others will recognize you for the sacrifice that you made, and that is really really cool. Uh, so then that is the unit of account function. It is a entrepreneurial tool to judge whether the future revenue, so the future, yeah, let's say that the future um, satisfaction of customers is going to be worth it to do. Because you don't want to waste your time and attention on building something that no one needs, that no one wants, that does not solve any problems. And so you have to first and foremost judge whether you actually solve a problem. And then you have to invest in it. And you have to invest in it less than the problem actually solves. Because if you have too much cost, if you create too many problems and you don't solve any problems, then you are a bad entrepreneur, right? You're wasting something, you're destroying wealth. And this is the function of unit of account, right? It's that you price your goods and services in that most liquid medium of exchange and store of value. And these three aspects is what makes any money useful, right? It is actually really, really useful to have such a good, a scarce good, which you can use to postpone your consumption, which you can then use to exchange for anything that you want, and which you can use in order to guesstimate if the things that you do are actually of value. That is the core aspect of a money. And you might be quite surprised, but Bitcoin actually fulfills all of these tasks, regardless whether or not it is on chain or off chain. So, a Bitcoin that you hold on the blockchain with just a single private key, uh, you can store your wealth just as much, right? You can not consume just by not spending that Bitcoin, right? And that is the store value part. You can at any time exchange it for goods and services at a later point of time, right? That is a medium of exchange. And of course, you can do your calculations, right? And you judge yourself whether or not you should buy that plastic crap with your precious satoshis on chain or not. But it also is the case for off chain. So if you have your Lightning Network node, uh, and you have some Bitcoin on there in that very specific Bitcoin script that represents the Lightning Network payment channel, but let's assume that you at this moment in time are not spending it, you're not buying stickers online, then even if it is on the Lightning Network, it is a store of value. You're not consuming it, you're not producing it, but you're storing your value for a future point in time. But of course, sooner or later, you will buy the stickers, right? You will go to Satoshi's place and buy a couple pixels. That is the medium of exchange aspect. And Bitcoin is just as good as being a medium of exchange on chain or off chain, right? Because medium of exchange just is the attribute of being able to exchange something for another, right? And Bitcoin can do that regardless. Sand can be a medium of exchange, water can be, anything can be. And of course, it is also a unit of account, right? We say still we have so and so many Satoshis on our Lightning Network node. Of course we do. And we still allocate them every single second. Um, but I would say, however, that Lightning Network, and that is, I think, what many people mean with what is a medium of exchange. They mean it is a method of payment. Oh, here. Yeah. A method of payment, a means of payment. So, actually, how do we transfer the property rights of a scarce goods from A to B, right? So, the medium of exchange part is just like kind of a why. Like, why do we exchange goods and services? Well, because we want to consume eventually. And now the means of payment part is how do we do that? And here, Lightning Network is very different. And of course, it's much superior for small transactions to be that means of payment, right? Because it is instant, it is ridiculously cheap, and it has all these other cool aspects of just making it a very useful method of payment, a very useful way of buying your goods and services. Okay, so let's say now, or yeah, let's go a bit further on how can we define and defend these property rights on the second layer? Because, right, on the first layer, we have a bunch of different scripts that we can use. And on the second layer, then, we still have scripts. We are still using Bitcoin script. We're still in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And especially the opening transaction, right? Where you actually uh, fund your Lightning Network node and then you open a network payment channel. So from Alice to Bob, right? That opening transaction, which commits Alice's single signature UTXO that only she controls, where only she has the property rights in. And then she uses that UTXO in order to fund the opening transaction of the Lightning Network UTXO, which is right the two of two multi-signature plus time lock and some other fancy stuff. And this opening transaction is secured by accumulated proof of work on the blockchain, as any other first layer script is, right? When you do a regular Bitcoin on chain transaction, it's the exact same thing. You get accumulated proof of work by miners making sure that there is no double spend, right? That they do on the time chain, the time ordering of transactions. And thus, the opening transaction is the same property rights or defense as uh, as any regular other transaction is. Because if Alice would not have the private key to that UTXO, which she wants to use to fund that opening transaction, right? If she cannot prove that with a signature, well, then it's an invalid transaction. And my full node will not propagate that transaction. And my full node will ban Alice for trying to steal someone else's UTXO, for breaking someone else's property rights. And of course, the immutable fortress of validation, which is the Bitcoin peer to peer network, uh, will not tolerate theft of private property, right? However, of course, right, Alice commits her Satoshis um, onto a new script, right? And this new script, as I said, is the two of two multi signature script. And um, she can then, at a later point in time, update that uh, state of this UTXO with the so called commitment transaction, right? So she can then say that, okay, no longer is the correct state of that UTXO 10 Bitcoin Alice, 0 Bitcoin Bob. But she can commit that the correct state, the current state, the up to date state of this payment channel is now, let's say, 9 to 1, right? So she shifts her property rights um, of 1 Bitcoin over to Bob, right? And she proves that and she commits to that with a unforgeable digital signature with the private key, right, that she controls. But and that digital signature, once she has given that to Bob, she can no longer take it back. Right? She has committed to transferring her property rights. And that commitment is being signaled with the digital signature, which again, like, is a non-scarce piece of communication. It's so beautiful that with this non-scarce digital signature, she can commit of transferring the property rights of the scarce Bitcoin. But um, contrarily to the opening transaction, which gets accumulated proof of work on the time chain, actually only the peer in that channel knows about that commitment, right? Bob does not propagate that commitment of 9 Bitcoin, 1 Bitcoin to the rest of the network and then to be included on the blockchain. But he keeps it locally, right, on his own hardware. Uh, and that, of course, means that first, right, it's more private, right? Not everyone knows the current state. Not everyone knows exactly how the property right has been shifted. But that also means, right, that if Bob um, is not careful, and if he loses this commitment, which he can, right, you can lose non-scarce information, you can forget something, um, but Bob then has to be careful with that, right? And he no longer has help from the rest of the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network, and of course of the accumulated proof of work. But again, so this old state then might still be considered valid by the network, right? Because the old state, the initial commitment, still has the digital signature by Alice, right? That said, okay, 10 Bitcoin Alice, 0 Bitcoin Bob, and that had a valid digital signature. And Alice gave her consent to represent the new property rights in that payment channel, like in that 10 to 0 state. However, it might be, right? Or then once she has done the update, right? Once she has committed to a new state of the property rights, um, then we might have the problem that Bob, right, needs to defend that, because the rest of the network does not know about the commitment to the current state of the private property. But of course, Bob has the unforgeable digital signature that proves that he actually is the rightful owner of that current state of the Bitcoin payment channel. Right? He has the property rights in that 1 Bitcoin because Alice has committed to it. She's given her word. That is a voluntary contract, must not never be broken. And so, if a malicious peer then tries to steal Satoshis from Bob, so if Alice has committed and if she has voluntarily agreed that the new correct state is 9-1, but then she turns around and tells the rest of the network through the Bitcoin proof of work blockchain, time chain, that the old state is actually valid. And it is, or it used to be a valid state, right? Thus, the rest of the network cannot by itself invalidate that. But then Alice, or then Bob, has to defend himself. He has to defend his property rights, and he has to prove that Alice has transferred his property rights to him. And he does that by publishing the latest state of the payment channel that contains the unforgeable digital signature by Alice. And the beautiful thing with that is that um, he can do so for like a couple blocks period of time. And as soon as he proves that Alice has actually, at a later point in time, promised him these Bitcoin, then he actually can punish the thief, right? Uh, and he can do so by then taking all of Alice's money, right? So if Alice publicizes an old state, she also publicizes a secret, the revocation secret, right? And this revocation secret allows Bob to then take all of her money, right? So if Alice goes out and publishes an old state, with that publishing, Bob now has the opportunity of making or of taking that money from the thief, right? Of punishing that thief. However, I have to say that this is only the case in the current implementation of the Lightning channels, right? The duplex micropayment channels. Um, and that has pros and cons, right? Of course, it's good that we kind of steal from the thief, but of course, there might be some like technical debt, right? That makes it more difficult to scale such a network that is based on a punishment transaction. And so, a proposal here, the new proposal of a Lightning Network payment channel called L2 does away with the punishing of the thief, but rather it's just a simple proof that, hey, nope, this is not the correct state. This is the correct state. And with L2, you can still prove that this is a correct state and that it has occurred at a later point in time, but you no longer have the revocation secret that gives you the opportunity to punish the thief. And here is the very important difference between these two implementations here of Lightning Network. And unfortunately, I don't have too much time to go into the beauties of L2 and how it is here in the difference. Um, but yeah, uh, so yeah, be careful, right, with L2 because you will no longer be able to punish the thief. And then maybe here for the last point, which I don't yet have a slide for, I see right here. Um, I would then further say that then having just the one payment channel would be cool, right? And you can do infinite numbers of commitments to the current state of the payment channel by just doing elliptical curve digital signatures. And that is super fast, it's super scalable. But of course, it's limited in the scope, in the sense that here, that you can only do the transfer of property rights with the one peer that you actually have done the payment channel, right? And so the beauty of the Lightning Network is that it is a network, right? It is this giant network of different payment channels that can then do a routing. And the routing then in the sense is a commitment to a commitment to forward a payment. Um, so in a sense that if Alice uh, promises money to Bob, but only if Bob forwards it to Charlie, right? That is the Lightning Network route. Alice promises to give Bob some property right in the Satoshis in their payment channel between Alice and Bob, but only under the condition that Bob will further that then transfer the property rights of Satoshis in a different payment channel that he has with Charlie. And then only under that condition, if Charlie then forwards that property rights of different Satoshis in a different UTXO, in a different Lightning Network payment channel, but he forwards that property rights to David. And all of these promises to, or not just promises, no, all of these commitments to the change of property rights, they happen atomically. So either the property shifts from Alice to Bob, from Bob to Charlie, from Charlie to David, or nothing happens at all. Right? This is the atomic part of Lightning Network payments. There is no way that the peer in the middle here, for example, Bob or Charlie, that they can steal the money, right? So it is impossible that Alice gives the property of the Satoshis to Bob, um, but then Bob does not forward them to Charlie, right? That is impossible because Bob can only get the property of the Bitcoin if and only if he has forwarded it to Charlie, right? And of course, we prove that routing chain and that true forwarding of the property rights with the hash with the hash commitment, right? So the receiver, in this sense, David, he generates the pre-image, right? He hashes that, and he gives that hash uh, to then Alice. And Alice, or right, that is the Lightning Network invoice, right? And that is basically a way that they can commit or they can use this secret, this non-scarce secret, in order to communicate with each other, so that they then at a later point in time can transfer the property rights atomically. And thus, then Alice will tell Bob that he can get her Satoshis, but only if he tells her that secret, right? So, in a sense, Alice is giving Bob a not a scarce Bitcoin, right? Uh, and but only in the condition that but only now we have the video back. But Alice gives that scarce Bitcoin to Bob, but in return for a non-scarce piece of information, right? That is quite profound because now we are exchanging scarce goods for non-scarce goods, at least here in the payment channel from Alice to Bob. And of course, Alice would most likely not just do that for the non scarce piece of information, right? Just for the hash pre image, Alice would not really be willing to sacrifice her scarce Satoshis because the hash pre image is just information. And so Bob would retain, or Bob does retain the hash pre image. He does not give it up, he just shares it with Alice. Uh, and Alice is only willing to do that, first and foremost, because Bob will forward these Satoshis. Bob will himself then sacrifice these Bitcoin, and he will sacrifice them to Charlie, only under the condition that, again, Charlie gives him that secret, right? And Bob would not do that if he, first and foremost, right, did not get the Satoshis from Alice, right? And then that he actually knew that he would keep the property rights of these Satoshis. And then right, further that goes for from Charlie to David. Charlie sells his Bitcoin for the non-scarce piece of information, which is the hash pre-image. And then David gives out that non-scarce piece of information. And with that sharing of knowledge, then he he gets the scarce satoshis, right? That is really really cool. uh, and then the entire chain reaction goes backwards, and only then does Alice actually hand over the property rights of her scarce Bitcoin, right? So that is here the aspect of routing. And I mean, then we might say, right, if Alice does get nothing else other than the hash pre-image, then why would she do it? Why would she spend her precious Satoshis? Well, of course, that is because a Lightning Network payment is not just in isolation, right? It is actually a payment for a good or a service. And it can be a scarce good service. For example, stickers, right? If you buy your stickers, David actually gives them away. He then no longer has the stickers, but Alice has them. and Alice can stick him on her laptop, and Bob can no longer. Thus, he sacrifices these scarce stickers only if Alice is willing to sacrifice her scarce Bitcoin, right? So there is, of course, a economic incentive and a mutual beneficial exchange of um, of scarce goods and services, Bitcoin and stickers. And thus, we can axiomatically prove that again, Alice and David are both better off, right? They both have a marginally superior thing now, and that is great. But why do Bob and Charlie do that, right? The man in the middle, so to say, because they don't get a scarce good, at least not from David, right? They don't get stickers, but what they do get is from Ellis the promise, or again the commitment rather, that they can keep just a couple satoshis for that service of provide of finding the path, of doing the routing, right, of taking money from the left hand to the right, and and in that sense, right, this they provide a service of allocating capital, of doing liquidity, and they do so, or and they get compensated for that service by the scarce Bitcoin. And thus, the routing fee of both Bob and Charlie is very important, because that is the incentive that they actually do in order to sacrifice and to invest their scarce resources. And they only do it because they get something in return, right? Of course they do. And that is a natural thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. So the service that they provide here is the capital allocation. And so this is basically it. This was the main part, I would say, here of my presentation on the sound economics of the Lightning Network. And how this all starts here with praxeology and what that actually is, and what scarcity and non-scarcity actually mean, and that Bitcoin is, well, kind of both. And Bitcoin thus kind of shatters the entire foundation of the universe. The protocol is non-scarce, but the currency is scarce. And because Bitcoin, the currency, is scarce, it can be sound money as store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. And it can fulfill these attributes as good on the chain as on the Lightning Network. But of course, the Lightning Network might be a more suitable way of transferring property rights, a more suitable method of payment. And so, of course, the blockchain is the immutable fortress of validation, right? Where we we enforce these, or we verify the transfer of property rights of any single full node in the network, right? And thus, for example, we don't need punishments on the blockchain, because just everyone validates everything, and thus everyone knows the current state. Everyone knows who has the property in what. And in Lightning Network and in payment channels, we no longer have that, right? It is something that is much more peer to peer. It is something that is more, mm, or at least more private, right? You don't share the current state of the payment channel, but you always have the opportunity or the possibility of sharing it at a later point in time. And if someone claims that the property right is actually something that it is not, right, a old state, a false state, then they can get punished, right? And these are the different stages of the payment channel: the opening, the closing, or the update and the closing. And of course, here the transferring of property rights with routing. So Piers, this has basically been it. I hope you appreciated this little talk here. And again, this was part of the Bolt-A-Thon uh, Lightning Network cyberspace conference, and I hope you enjoyed it. But the main part of these sessions was also that you can ask questions. So unfortunately, I did not yet see too many questions here in the chat, and unfortunately, it seems like you are not in the Google Hangouts. So if you scroll up there in the chat, there is the Google Hangouts link. So I would just keep on blabbering for a teeny tiny bit more. But if you want to, if you have a question, then please go ahead and and ask that question now, either in the chat or jump into the Hangouts, kind of like the call-in show. You do need to have a Google Hangouts account or just a YouTube account for jumping into. Oh, uh, I think the wrong. Oh, it just sent the wrong link here. Okay. Yep. Okay, now the second link is actually here in the Google Hangouts. So if you have a question, now is the time. Now jump in, either in the chat or in the yeah in the video conference. Mm, and maybe in the meantime, I'll take a little drink. Mm, so yeah, maybe then a bit further on, right? The aspect of how do we enforce the property right claims in Lightning Network without necessarily relying on the time chain network level consensus. Very tricky. Because, yes, I mean, this is a beautiful concept, right? And we can at any time commit back to the chain. But what would happen if we don't do that? What would happen if we can get, or if we just continue to be in the Lightning Network? Can we break property rights if we kind of take away the blockchain? Uh, of course, right, Lightning only works with the blockchain in conjunction, but let's just assume that we don't settle back on the main chain. What would happen then? Well, there could actually be an increase in the money supply. There could, right? Because if Alice and Bob have their payment channel of, let's say, 10 Bitcoin, and they are on the time chain, right? And they are enforced and validated by the entire network of Bitcoin full nodes. And then they'll further, right? Uh, if Alice and Bob just commit to a state of their payment channel where Alice has 20 and Bob has 10, so just each of them gets 10 additional Bitcoin. Well, is that valid? Well, yes and no. I mean, if Alice and Bob collude, right, if they both agree that they are going to give themselves extra Bitcoin in this payment channel, then sure, they can do that and they can sign that message, right? Uh, But of course, as soon as they would uh, try to publish this, as soon as they would then try to um, yeah, claim this property right with the rest of the network on chain, the entire thing would fall apart because the first node that sees this closing transaction from or the commitment transaction being published in the closing transaction, they would be like, no, you don't have 20 and 10 Bitcoin capacity in this payment channel. You only have 10 0, right? So you're trying, so your outputs are larger than the inputs, right? And then again, we have the fortress of validation doing exactly its job. But in the payment channel itself, Alice and Bob can do whatever the fuck they want, right? But of course, will others accept that? And especially, what would happen in a route? So again, Alice, Bob, Charlie, Charlie, David. If Alice and Bob say, okay, all of a sudden we have instead of 10 0, 20 0, 2010, right? Then of course Alice and Bob can transact as much as they want. But what would happen if Alice wants to send a route or payment to David? And let's assume that Charlie and David are honest peers, right? Well, then Alice would commit, or David would generate the hash pre image, right? The invoice, or sorry, he would hash that. And that would be the invoice with some other info. Um, and then he sends that back to Alice. And Alice then tells Bob that she will shift the state from 20 to 10 to 19 to 11, right? So still there's inflation inside the payment channel. Um, and she can commit to that with her signature. It's going to be a valid signature over a wrong transaction, but still a valid signature. And Bob can check and validate that signature. Um, and then, of course, Bob can only get that current state if and only if he then gives her the pre image. So then he has to turn around and go to Charlie and be like, hey, Charlie, our payment channel is 5 and 5. And I commit now to the payment channel state of 4 and 6, but only if you give me the hash pre-image, right? So what happened here? Yes, there is inflation for Alice and Bob, but there cannot be inflation for Bob and Charlie. Because if Bob would propose, hey, it's no longer 5 and 5, but it's 5 and 6. So I just give you one extra Bitcoin out of nothing, right? Then Charlie would be like, well, no, this is wrong. You are trying to spend more outputs than you have inputs. This is a wrong transaction. And Charlie knows that he could not go to someone else, and especially not to the Bitcoin blockchain with that transaction because it spends more outputs than it has in the inputs. And thus the Charlie would immediately say, no, I do not accept that. And I will not give you the hash pre-image because I will, Charlie will not even turn around to David to ask him for that hash pre-image and pay David, right? Because Charlie would get a claim to Bitcoin that he cannot enforce on the network level consensus. Um, yeah, and that here it stops, right? As soon as there's one honest party in the payment channel, like he is not going to further the payment because he knows that this is a fraudulent claim. But of course, um, or but so the other case that could happen is that again, Alice and Bob now increase their channel from 10.0 to 2010, and then Bob wants to still get like that one Bitcoin from Alice. So he wants to have the current state of 19 and 11 somehow. Then what he could do is he could go to Bob and from Bob to Charlie and be like, "Hey, I give you the state of 4 and 6, which is again like in total 10, so no inflation here, but only for the hash pre-image." And then Charlie can be like, "Sure, this is a valid commitment transaction. Sure, this is a valid signature. I could at any time publish this to the blockchain." And then Charlie would go further and like request the payment, the hash pre-image from David, and pay David, and the route would go through. But what has now happened? Bob has gotten the one Bitcoin on the fraudulent channel, right? On the inflation channel. And he cannot publish that inflation channel uh, because it's not correct. And thus, right, um, Bob has gotten fake Bitcoin that are not the true thing. But he has given away to Charlie real Bitcoin that Charlie can at any time spend to the public blockchain and enforce that property rights now also in the fortress of validation. So, in that sense, Bob has received fake Bitcoin from Alice, but he's given away correct Bitcoin to Charlie. And that's, of course, stupid. And he would never do that. So therefore, there is no inflation in the Lightning Network, right? Because we always have the fallback option of the main chain. And of course, the other peers doing the validation. That's just all that the main chain is. It's just everyone is validating everything. And as soon as we validate everything, which at least the people in the route are doing, and at the minimum, the entire blockchain is doing then, or full node network is doing, as soon as the channel is closed, so yes, you can have Ponzi schemes and inflation as much as you want in your private channel, but you cannot do that with me, right? Because my node is going to enforce consensus and I'm not going to let you spend fake Bitcoin, right? Especially not to me because I don't want to have them. I want to have the real thing. So in that sense, no, there is no fractional reserve in Lightning. There is no inflation in Lightning uh, because it is still enforceable, it is still verifiable, and we always have the option to ask the rest of the network. Okay, so but now in the meantime, I see that we have a couple cool and interesting questions here in the chat. Um, so Xaya Zaza says, why are they getting rid of the penalties for channel cheaters? Hmm, very, very good question, right? Because it would make sense, right? To say, hey, if you cheat from me, I punish you for that. And I punish you by taking your money. And that's a huge incentive not to steal, right? Um, but that also means, well, first and foremost, you can accidentally cheat, right? Or try to cheat, right? So that happens, for example, if you if your node gets corrupted and and just the database is being lost, and you no longer have the current state of the payment channel, and then you no longer know what the current correct valid thing is. And then if you publish a old state just by you thinking that it is the most current thing, but it's actually not because you've lost access to the older or the most recent states, then you accidentally have or trying to scam the other, right? So in that sense, um, we we might be too vigilant, and we might then um, punish someone who is actually not really wanted to do that. Just he's just made an honest mistake, right? So that would be not optimal, right? But I don't think that that is the main reason. I think the main reason is that the current Lightning Network payment channels, as they are right now, because we have that punishment, because we always have to consider this revocation secret. Um, it's just much more complicated and larger transactions, which require more on-chain space. And on-chain space again is scarce because in one block there can only be, I don't know, like 3,000 transactions and not more. And these 3,000 transactions, either it's transaction from Alice to Bob, or it's a transaction from Charlie to David. It cannot be both of them at the same time, right? So block space is scarce, right? Thus we need, thus there, right? Oh yeah, yeah, it's scarce. um, yeah, so it's an efficiency gain. It's easier to do backups. It's easier to do with L2 now speaking. It's easier to do backups. It requires less block space. It's easier to do watchtowers. Um, and so basically L2 again. I unfortunately don't have too much time going into it, but basically what we just do, it's very easy to prove that a that the current state or that a current state or a later state, so to say, actually did come before after the previous state. So if Bob is then publishing a previous state, Alice can easily prove with L2 that no, this is not the previous state, this is the correct state. Um, but she has to prove the correct state or the most recent state. Um, and that most recent state, of course, Bob or the malicious Bob, right, the attacker, still has his money, right? So let's assume it's 10-0 again, Alice Bob. Alice sends one Bitcoin to Bob, so it's 9 and 1. If Alice publishes the 10-0 transaction, then Bob can prove that no, a more recent state, some channel commitment, a change of property rights has occurred afterwards, and that is 9 and 1. But here Alice still gets back the 9, right? Bob does not have the opportunity to take away the 9. But he just has the opportunity to prove this is the correct state, and that is then being enforced on the blockchain. So it's an efficiency thing, um, and it's less of an incentive, or well, there's a huge incentive to not steal in the current implementation, and there's only a minor incentive to not steal in L2. Well, first and foremost, if the node is online, then he can always easily prove that this is an old state. And further, that the attacker still needs to make a on-chain transaction, and so the on-chain transaction is still then draining his account a little bit. And because it's so easy for Bob, the honest person, to prove that he is stealing from him, he has the cost of doing a on-chain transaction without necessarily having a lot of the reward. So yeah, that's L2 in a nutshell. Um, Ask Christian Decker. He is much more knowledgeable about this. Did he speak at the Bolt-A-Thon conference? Let me check. Um, no, looks like he did not. But I'm sure there are a bunch of other people there. Maybe you even did talk about L2 there. Not quite certain, but yeah, L2 is cool, but it is a different trade-off here. Okay, next question that we have. Let me share the screen again. Would be right here from Jude Zhu. Does the Lightning Network, will it become centralized for providing this service of routing? Interesting question, right? So I would say we don't know, right? Because it hasn't yet happened. And Lightning Network is based of human ingenuity, right? And it's based of peers engaging in their everyday lives, and you cannot predict that. So I cannot say for sure. I cannot praxeologically prove it, right? Because it's in the future. But I can give you a educated guess, and I would say no. Or well, the question is, what is centralization, right? And routing is a service, right? Running a routing node, and I'm sure Alex Prosper talked about that, is not easy, right? You need to manage your liquidity, you need to manage your channels, you need to provide capital, right? Um, because you lock the routing liquidity up for a couple of blocks. With the hash time lock contract that is in the routing hashed time lock contract, like the hash preimage. Um, so there's an opportunity cost to it, and it's a specialized service, and this means that, of course, right, so you're one is investing scarce resources, so he deserves a compensation. That's a monetary incentive, right? But then also this means that some people are going to be better than others, right? Alex Brosworth or Pierre Richard, right, who both have been on the Lightning Network for a long time and who both have done many, many Lightning Network payments and who have set up great nodes that are very well connected and that do a pretty damn good job of providing liquidity in a very short route. Um, and thus, because they are entrepreneurs who provide a better service than, for example, L and Big, right, who is just spamming the network with channel openings, not necessarily doing smart resource allocation, this then would mean that they are entrepreneurs that just better entrepreneurs, and they remove my uneasiness of wanting to make a payment better than others. And so I'm willing to pay them and not pay the other one. Um, and thus, yes, there is going to be a hierarchy of nodes. Some nodes are going to be better than others, but that's not inherently centralization, because the beauty of the Lightning Network is that it is as permissionless as Bitcoin on chain. You can open a Lightning Network payment channel like that. Don't have to ask for permission. You just do an on chain transaction and you fund it, right? And then you have your Lightning Network node up and running. And you could then start sending and receiving payments, right? Without again asking for permission. So the barrier for entry for new entrepreneurs providing that service is ridiculous low. As a matter of fact, like most of the consumers of the Lightning Network, like those who just want to do payment first and foremost, um, they can still act as a routing node, right? They might not be the best routing node. They might not. They might not do the best job at it, but they can at any time do the service of routing payments, right? And they might not specialize in this, and this might not be their priority, but still they can. And because they can, as soon as we see one individual node being like the central point of failure, or just in general providing a shitty service, then others can come in and provide a better service. So, for example, right, centralization is just a buzzword. What we want to have is censorship resistant. So, if we have a central hub in the middle of the Lightning Network who does all of the routes go through him, and then he starts censoring and be like, "Oh, Alice, you want to pay David? No, I'm not going to route that payment." Um, then Alice can be like, "Oh, okay, well then I'm not going to pay you, right? You're not going to get anything for that." So first and foremost, or well, no, Alice is going to say, "I'm willing to pay you if you provide that service for me," right? And then the malicious bad actor like Charlie can still be like, "Well, yeah, yeah, you would pay me, but I personally value not to do that payment, not to do that route higher than receiving that lightning or that payment," right? And that's, to be honest, very much in Charlie's right. You don't have to do a route. Like this is a sacrifice that Charlie is doing, and Alice cannot force Charlie to do that sacrifice. She can incentivize him by promising him him a payment, right, and some sats, and then maybe Charlie is going to do that route because he will realize that, yeah, actually I can get something for that. It's not just me giving away scarce resources and sacrificing them for nothing. No, you actually have the opportunity here of making a payment, right, of getting something back. So there's incentive for Charlie to do that payment and to not be a dick and and censor her payment. But then on the other hand, um, then Alice could directly open a payment channel to David, right? Not road payments at all, right? In direct payment channels, they cannot be censored whatsoever. You don't even know that that the transactions are going on. There's no attribution possible, right? Um, so there is no censorship in individual channel. Or then Alice could then on the other side would just be okay. I'm not gonna route from Alice to Bob to Charlie to David, but I'm going to route from Alice to Bob to Eli to David. So I'm just going to route around that person who is trying to censor me, right? And as long as Bob has more than one channel, so he has channel to Charlie, who's the bad actor, but he also has a node to E, to F, to G, and so on. And some one of these will have a route. And the network is a network. It's not hub and spoke. Um, I mean, look on Lightning Network Explorers. They are like Lightning Network is very well connected, and you will almost always find a route within 2 hops, 3 hops, maybe 5 hops. But sooner or later, you will find a route, um, especially for small payments. Right? Still a lot of efficiencies to be gained, for sure. Um, but so my educated guess would be that no, Lightning Network cannot be censored, and thus it's not centralized, right? There's no single point of failure, and if there is one, we can around it, right? Okay. Um, yeah, we have another great question here by Casso20 in the chat, uh, right here. And he asks, do we need a soft fork for L2? Um, yes, but by the way, so L2 is actually spelled ELTOO. Okay, that is like the cheesy name for Lightning, a simplified update mechanism for Lightning. And here, that is like Blockstream, developed by a bunch of people there. First and foremost, Christian Decker. Again, he's really good with that, and he will be on the World Crypto Network soon to talk about L2 and how exactly it works. But yes, we need to do a consensus layer upgrade to the non-scarce Nakamoto consensus rules. And especially, we need a new opcode which is called sighash no input. So basically, um, how do I explain that easily? Because I still it's complex. So we have the funding transaction, right, where Alice, from her single signature, sends money sends money to, that's not how UTXOs works, but still she funds a UTXO that has the 2 of 2 L2 payment channel, right? And that is the funding transaction. And then she can do a commitment transaction that says spend from that funding transaction, right? And spend that and spend to this and this, right? Spend to the next, like to my single signature key again. And then she can sign that commitment transaction, and she could sign the entire thing, right? So she would hash both the inputs and the outputs, and then she would do a signature of that. That would be the SIG hash all flag. And I think, not certain that SIG hash all is used in the current implementation of the Lightning Network. But the cool thing with L2 is that then for the second commitment, what she would say is that um, is that don't don't fund this transaction from the commitment from the funding transaction, but fund the closing transaction with the commitment transaction UTXO. Um, and basically, so we need to have a opportunity of 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 sending a on-chain payment without, or of committing to sending a on-chain payment without yet knowing how we are going to fund that. Um, so we just say, I'm committing to a payment that goes to here, like that goes to this new UTXO, this new output, but I'm not yet committing which input I'm going to use to fund that output. Um, and that is basically say cash no input. And we need that for L2. And yeah, it's soft fork, should be coming in 2 weeks, hopefully with the Schnorr as soft fork as well. I think there's not too much technical difficulties here. It's just any fork is going to be non-trivial, and we need to be careful to not fuck it up. But I think we can do that. Um, yeah. Okay, we have the next question here by Satoshi Economy. Will Bitcoin become a peer-to-peer for sovereign nations? Um, yeah, great question, right? Will will states use Bitcoin, and will they be peers on the network? Um, how do I answer that? So right now, nation states are not peers. They steal from you, right? And they take what is yours. They take your private property, and thus they're not your friends. They're not your peers, because they are above you, right? They can take something that is your property, right? And so they are the master, you are the slaves, right? There's a master-slave relationship here. So a nation state, per definition, or well, I define a state as being a institution that is deliberately designed to steal from others. That's a nation state for me. You might even say like it's on in a physical territory like a country. Um, so, in a sense, can nation states use Bitcoin? No, they cannot, and they will never be able to do so because Bitcoin defends property rights with unbreakable mathematical encryption and cryptography. So, a nation state can, or a state in general, cannot exist in Bitcoin, or politics cannot exist in Bitcoin because you cannot steal from another one in Bitcoin. If you do not have the private key, if you do not have the secret, you are not going to be able to steal money from that UTXO. Uh, and so, if you take care of your secrets, if you don't leak your private keys, then it is impossible for someone to steal from you. And thus, it is impossible, per definition, that a state will use Bitcoin, right? However, the the individuals who are in the state, they can of course leave the state behind. They can leave away their old and their wrong ways of stealing from others and aggressing from others, and they can come to their senses and realize that we must not murder, we must not steal, we must not rape, we must not pillage. And they can then say, okay, I was wrong, I did something, that I took something which was not mine, and now I'm going to stop doing that, right? I'm not going to take your Bitcoin. I'm not going to just try to steal them, because I cannot, right? Because 2 + 2 = 4. That's how strong the mathematics is, right? Um, and in that sense, then, as soon as the bureaucrats from the state become a Bitcoin full node, right? As soon as they run one, they are no longer state actors. Then they are peers on the Bitcoin network because they can no longer steal from each other, right? So then they are peers. So, in that sense, Bitcoin is always, and it has always been, and it will always be a network of peers that are on the same level, right? There is no power differential or aggressive power differential in the sense that one can steal from the other. And thus, there can never be state adoption of Bitcoin. But there can only be bureaucrats who adopt the anarchistic, the peaceful ways of Bitcoin by stopping from stealing from others. Yeah. Um, okay. I hope that kind of helped you. But well, so will like bureaucrats use Bitcoin? Yeah, for sure. Anyone can use Bitcoin. It's permissionless, right? And that goes for both on chain, right? Anyone can run a full node, download the blocks, verify them. Like it's non-scarce information. You can have them. No worries. Like I still retain mine, so you can have yours. I can give you a copy for sure. And I will give a copy of the Bitcoin blockchain to anyone, right? Because well, quite literally, any full node that is asking my full node for some blocks will get them. Mm, but then again, like they can't steal from me, so they're no longer the state. They're just peaceful individuals. So I guess my answer is kind of yes and no. Um, the individuals of the state will hopefully soon realize their flawed ways and be peaceful. And as soon as they are peaceful, they are peers on the network. So yes and no. We have here a cool question by Konstantin. Um, and he is asking, do you see the possibility of side chains threatening the scarcity of Bitcoin? I think the arguments against drive, I think it was an argument against the drive chain soft fork. Hmm. Okay. Um, difficult to say here again. Well, and I think like the main misunderstanding here might be one of definitions. So let me go back to screen share actually, because scarcity, as I define it, and as I would think is the correct definition, is that it can only be controlled by one individual at one time. And in Bitcoin, right, that does apply to the UTXO. One value field in the output can only be spent with one script, right, and no other script. So if Alice has a UTXO that she can only spend with her private key, then the same UTXO cannot be spent by Bob's private key, right? So that is the scarcity of Bitcoin. Do sidechains threaten this? No, they don't. The UTXO of Alice is Alice's UTXO, or well, the private key of Alice, right? And what you do elsewhere doesn't really matter. Uh, it is hers, and there's still the potential of conflict over control. Um, Yeah, but I think, Konstantin, I think what you're talking about is the rarity of Bitcoin, the abundance of Bitcoin, the quantity of Bitcoin in existence, right? Because we can have a scarce good that is almost infinite in quantity, a super abundant good. For example, sand, right? How many like corns of sand are there? Like in beaches, like in the deserts, infinite, near infinite amounts, right? But they're still scarce. Either I hold a handful of sand or you hold a handful of sand. We cannot at the same time hold the same sand in our hands. It's impossible, right? So sand is scarce, but it is not abundant. That's why it's a shitty money, right? But it could be a money because it is scarce. It's just a bad one. Um, and so what sidechains might be able to do is that they can increase the money supply of Bitcoin in a sense that we have, according to Nakamoto consensus, and because of the difficulty adjustment, especially, and the halvening, we have a limit of 21 million Bitcoin, right? And that is the abundance of Bitcoin, right? The number of Bitcoin, the quantity of Bitcoin. That has nothing to do with scarcity, not at all whatsoever. That is rarity. Big, big, big difference. Um, and Bitcoin is a good money and a sound money because it is limited in supply and unchanging in the issuance rate of that money supply. Um, and again, I'm not quite certain about the details here, but I would say that it is impossible for the parent chain to suffer from additional inflation, from an increase in the money supply uh, that is above as it would be. That is inflation, right? Issuance rate is not necessarily inflation. The issuance rate in Bitcoin, as we see it, is no inflation. It's an issuance rate. But if we would have a break in the cryptographic things, like for example with confidential transactions or some other way, right, that would increase the money supply artificially, then that would be inflation because someone is being stolen from. Inflation is per definition theft. And the issuance rate, as we see it in Bitcoin, is voluntarily agreed upon. And thus, it is no inflation because it is no theft. Um, however, what What might happen, um, and I have to assume that you know like the basics of sidechains. There are videos on the World Crypto Network explaining that. But basically, um, we fund a multi-signature wallet, or like that would be a federated sidechain. We can do that with like long time windows with like drive chains, right? But basically, we fund scarce on-chain Bitcoin, right? And we put them into a smart contract, similar as we do it with Lightning Network, and then we can use these scarce Bitcoin that are locked on chain, and we can prove that with a SPV proof. And then we can use that proof in order to generate a new cryptographic asset, a new scarce good, um, that is new. It is different. It is a different thing, right? And we can manage the property rights of these new currencies, of the new scarce good. Let's call them liquid Bitcoin, for example, or just sidechain Bitcoin. um, and we can manage the property rights in a different system. Can be anything. Can be a centralized database, right? Can be a tangle, whatever the fuck that is. It can be a proof of stake chain. It can be a trusted, semi-trusted federation signing chain, as with Liquid. Could be a proof of work chain. Doesn't matter. How we defend or manage these property rights. But it's important that it's a different good. And then in and then, yeah, what might happen then is that there is a mistake or a inflation, or just a bug or theft occurring on the sidechain, right? If we have IOTA's tangle, it's going to be a shit show. So then we're going to have inflation sooner or later. But it's going to be on the sidechain, right? And as we then close that sidechain and try to move back on chain, then like the fortress of validation of full nodes is going to realize that and be like, oh no, no, there's inflation going on, I don't accept that. Like, there are only 10 Bitcoin locked up in that multi-sig on the Bitcoin parent blockchain, and what you proposed now, the 100 Bitcoin, are fake Bitcoin. So my Bitcoin parent chain full node will not accept that. So no inflation on the parent chain. um, Somewhat similar as we see it with Lightning Network, right? There can be inflation inside the payment channel, right? Because Alice and Bob can sign whichever messages they want. And they can give themselves billions of Bitcoin, right? And they can put a valid signature on there, right? They can still even fulfill like outputs smaller than inputs, but they can just increase the total capacity, or something like that. They can do that, right? But as soon as they try to publish that, then they will, yeah, we will know that, right? And we will not accept that. um, However, I think sidechains might be a bit worse than, or for the inflation thing as Lightning, because with Lightning, as soon as you try to make a route and there's one honest person in that route, the payment is going to fail and your inflation scheme is going to blow up, right? With a sidechain, let's assume that there is successful inflation, right? And let's assume that the money printer, the central bank, the state, the theft, the thief, he then gets the property rights of these newly printed monies, more money units, and then the Cantillon effect kicks in. Those that produce money and those that receive the newly printed money first, they gain in wealth, in percentage of the total money supply, and they gain at the expense of those that hold the currency and that receive the newly printed money at a later point in time. And that is theft, right? Um, and so, if the attacker, if the money printer um, gets a lot of the purchasing power um, by stealing it from others, but he is the first one to leave the sidechain, then like as long as he only takes out so much as is actually on the real main chain, he will have a valid transaction, right? So let's assume there are 10 Bitcoin on the sidechain, right? At any time 10 Bitcoin can come back out. If there's inflation on the sidechain, then for example 100 Bitcoin, then the question is, who is the first out of the door? And if the malicious attacker is the first one, and most likely that is going to be the case because, well, he is the bad actor, right? So we assume that. Then he would get these 10 Bitcoin that are locked on the parent chain in the multisig. And the honest people, right, who are on the sidechain, who are holding the sidechain UTXOs, that they think are valid, right? Because they might be valid on the sidechain, but when they try to commit that back onto the parent chain, then they will realize that, oh no, this is actually not working, and I cannot get my money back, right? And in that sense, a sidechain, I think, and again, I'm not certain about this, is worse in that case than Lightning Network, because with Lightning Network, um, like you cannot accept inflated coins if you are a honest person. But with a sidechain, you might be able to accept inflated sidechain Bitcoin, right? And then the first one out of the door is going to scam you. Um, so yeah. hmm So sidechains don't threaten the scarcity of Bitcoin because that's a binary thing, and UTXOs are only controlled by one script. But and they don't threaten the rarity of Bitcoin, the quantity of Bitcoin, right? Because the fortress of validation is going to see as soon as there's something wrong going on. But still, people might get stolen from because of the Cantillon effect and because the first person out of the door is going to benefit greatly. So yeah, Konstantin, now I hope that question I answered that question somewhat logically. Piers, it's been already long of a show. I hope you took some value out of this. And again, just to summarize here, this was the talk on the sound economics of the Lightning Network and just the different ways here of how the Lightning Network defines property rights and how it defends them. And this was my talk at the Bolt-A-Thon Lightning Network cyberspace conference. And again, I'm very, very sorry that I missed my slot yesterday or the day after by just messing up and two conference at once are kind of too much but I actually only would have had 50 minutes for the real like main thing, and now I had like 1.5 almost 2 hours, so that is nice. So I hope you got some additional information that you think is valuable, and again, thank you very much to let me actually just type in here sessions. Okay. Because thank you very much to all the 15 people who actually did buy a ticket to my session here at the Bolt-A-Thon hacker or thingy conference here. So yeah, 15 tickets. That is awesome. And also the votes that I got for proposing here my talk. So almost what is that? That is almost 4 million satoshis got collected, and that's almost as much as the lightning torches right now. And so the cool thing is with the Bolt-A-Thon Lightning Network Conference is that 20% of these funds go directly to the organizers of the conference, who very much deserve that because they have a beautiful event here that really is nice to bring together all the people, and it scales quite nicely because anyone can submit a talk, right? And then as many people as want can watch it. So that is really cool. And 80% of these 4 million satoshis are going to go directly to me for sacrificing my scarce time, right? I could have just stayed home and drank beer, but I could not do that because I invested my time into talking to you right now. And so that was a sacrifice, and I will get compensation for that sacrifice in form of 80% of these 4 million sats. So that is really, really awesome. I think this is a great conference, and I hope that you have already watched the last talks of all these awesome people here. And then there will be recordings uploaded in the next some when. They still have to do some editing. But it is already clear that this is not going to be the last Bolt-A-Thon conference because this really was a great success. So there will be future Bolt-A-Thons in the future. So stay tuned. And I will most likely going to be part of them as well because I love this concept. And I think it's really worth here supporting. So again, thank you very much to all the speakers that sacrificed their time here. Really, it's like a rock star panel here, even with a rock star death. um, so yeah, thank you also for hanging out in the chat. Unfortunately, we didn't get a caller in here live. That's I really tried to make sure that I will make it on time here next time, because I'm sure there were a bunch of people who who had questions and now could not ask them directly. Um, so yeah, again, sorry for messing up. I hope, or yeah, and I really hope that those who did buy the tickets here and who did vote for that they're not too mad with me for messing up because yeah, well, I mean, here's the information. And again, if you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to reach out. Uh, my website is open at towardsliberty.com/contact with all my contact details. Shoot me an email, max@towardsliberty.com, or just a Twitter DM at HillebrandMax on Twitter. Again, all that information on my website, towardsliberty.com, as well as an archive of knowledge of Bitcoin, Austrian economics, and natural law, libertarian philosophy. So I think quite a lot of value on that site, valuable information, non-scarce information. That's why I can give it away for free. um, Okay, and we have like the last comment here by Edison Brusk, who says, "Thank you, Max. Very nice that you made this presentation here. I was one of the guys who bought the ticket, and I really was waiting for your speech. So again, hey, awesome! Thank you, Edson, for buying that ticket. I really appreciate that, and not just for supporting me here with 80% of that, but also 20% going to the conference organizers. And I hope that this." That yeah that this was a compensation enough for me messing up and not attending everything on time. um Okay, I guess that was it. Keep on stacking sats. Keep on being reckless. Very congratulations to all the peers who partook in the hackathon, because the Bolt-A-Thon also had a hackathon. And Billy Garrison, I know, made the third place. Unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head who has the second and first place, but definitely great that you peers are hacking on and making Lightning Network more usable, more awesome, and just building out this so beautiful and complex and non-trivial network of property right defense. And I very much appreciate it. And I hope that you appreciate here my little blabbering about that as well. So thank you very much and see you on the next show. Bye bye.